June 14, 1944, 3 kilometers south of Villers-Bocage, Normandy, Sergeant William Crawford crouched behind the stone wall of a bombed-out farmhouse, watching 15 massive German Tiger tanks roll through the narrow country lane like prehistoric creatures emerging from morning fog. The British veteran believed he had perhaps 20 minutes before his position would be overrun, perhaps 30, if luck favored him. He was absolutely wrong about everything, except one detail. The photograph of his daughter tucked inside his breast pocket would not leave France without him. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Crawford could not have known as he studied those armored giants was that his improvised solution, born from desperation and a tanker's intimate knowledge of machinery, would become one of the most analyzed tactical innovations of the Normandy campaign. Within 60 minutes, not a single one of those 15 Tigers would remain operational, and the method he employed would be quietly documented in Allied tactical manuals for years to come. William Crawford was 38 years old that summer morning, older than most sergeants in his tank recovery unit. His personnel file told a simple story. Enlisted in 1939, trained as a mechanical engineer at the Royal Tank Regiment Depot in Bovington, widowed in 1941 during the London bombings that claimed his wife Margaret. What the file did not mention was how he had raised his 7-year-old daughter Emma alone for 3 years before shipping to Normandy, or how every letter she sent him was read so many times the paper had become soft as cloth. The tactical situation that morning represented everything that could go wrong in the chaotic weeks following the invasion. Crawford's recovery section, consisting of 8 men and 2 breakdown trucks, had been separated from their parent unit during the previous night's confused withdrawal. British and Canadian forces were reorganizing after the bruising encounter at Villers-Bocage, where a single German tank commander had temporarily stopped an entire armored column. Now Crawford found his small group caught between 2 forces, with no radio, no armor support, and no clear route to friendly lines. Private David Hughes, the youngest member of Crawford's section at 19 years old, had been the first to spot the approaching column through the early morning mist. Hughes remembered later during his debriefing the way his hands had shaken as he counted the tanks. He had seen Tigers before, knew their reputation, understood what their 88mm guns could do to anything except the thickest Allied armor. 15 of them in a single column meant this was likely a company-strength unit repositioning for a counterattack. Crawford had studied the approaching formation through borrowed binoculars for nearly 5 minutes before speaking. The tanks were moving in road march formation, not combat spread, suggesting their commanders felt secure in this sector. More importantly to Crawford's experienced eye, they were moving fast, perhaps 25 kilometers per hour, eager to reach their assembly area before Allied aircraft could spot them. Fast movement meant hot engines, meant crews focused on navigation rather than perimeter security, meant opportunities for someone desperate enough to exploit them. Corporal James Mitchell, Crawford's second-in-command, had fought in North Africa and recognized immediately what his sergeant was considering. Mitchell said later that he had seen that particular expression on Crawford's face only twice before, both times before actions that earned commendations and nearly got them terminated from service. Mitchell asked the question everyone was thinking: what could 8 men with rifles and 2 trucks possibly do against 15 of the most powerful tanks ever built? Crawford's answer had been characteristically precise. Their breakdown trucks carried, among other recovery equipment, approximately 400 liters of high-octane petrol in jerry cans, intended for refueling stranded vehicles. The narrow lane the German column was using had high stone walls on both sides, remnants of Norman hedgerow country that had survived centuries of agriculture. The lead tank was perhaps 800 meters away, and the morning wind was blowing from the west, directly across the lane. Mitchell understood before Crawford finished explaining, and the corporal's expression changed from confusion to something approaching awe mixed with absolute terror. The plan Crawford outlined in 90 seconds violated every conventional tactical doctrine. They would position both trucks at a bend in the lane where the walls were highest, creating a natural choke point. They would distribute the petrol across the road surface in quantities calculated to create maximum vapor concentration. They would ignite it not as the first tank reached the position, but as the entire column was strung out through the killing zone. Then they would abandon the position immediately, using a drainage ditch that Crawford had identified 400 meters to the east. Private Robert Anderson, who had worked as a chemist before the conflict, raised the obvious technical objection. Liquid petrol burns, he said, but petrol vapor explodes when properly mixed with air. The concentration would need to be precise. Too little, and they would create annoying fires that would warn the German crews. Too much and the vapor would be too rich to ignite properly. Crawford's response demonstrated why he had been selected for specialized training in tank recovery. He knew exactly how much petrol vapor a running tank engine would pull through its cooling systems, and he knew what happened when that vapor concentration reached the air intake manifolds. The next 40 minutes existed in Crawford's memory as a sequence of movements performed with mechanical precision, despite hands that wanted to shake. His men distributed every drop of petrol they possessed across a 70-meter stretch of lane, painting the ancient stone walls with liquid fuel, soaking the dirt road surface until it gleamed in the morning light. They worked in complete silence, except for Crawford's quiet instructions, each man understanding that discovery at this stage meant certain defeat. Hughes was tasked with the most critical element, timing the ignition. He positioned himself behind the eastern wall with a flare gun and matches, watching the approaching column through a gap in the stones. Crawford had explained that Hughes needed to wait until the 8th or 9th tank in the column was adjacent to his position, ensuring that approximately half the formation would be trapped in the saturated zone when ignition occurred. It was a calculation that assumed steady tank spacing, continued favorable wind conditions, and Hughes's ability to overcome his terror long enough to execute properly. The sound of 15 Tiger tanks advancing in column created a physical presence before they appeared. Crawford, positioned in the drainage ditch with his remaining 7 men, felt the vibrations through the earth like approaching thunder. Each Tiger weighed approximately 57,000 kilograms, powered by a Maybach engine producing 700 horsepower. When 15 such machines moved together, they announced their presence to every sense. Mitchell watched the lead tank through field glasses as it entered the prepared zone. The commander stood in his cupola, head and shoulders visible above the turret, studying the terrain ahead with professional competence. The tank moved at a steady 20 kilometers per hour now, slowed slightly by the narrow confines. The second tank followed at proper interval, then the third. Mitchell counted softly under his breath, giving Crawford updates on spacing and speed. Everything depended on concentration, timing, and a principle of thermal dynamics that Crawford had learned servicing broken tanks in the North African desert. Hughes later said that the hardest part was not pulling the trigger, but waiting those extra seconds while the 7th, 8th, and 9th tanks moved into position. He could see the German crews clearly now, could make out individual faces, could observe the casual confidence of men who believed themselves the masters of this battlefield. When the 9th tank's bow was directly aligned with his hiding spot, Hughes stood, aimed the flare gun at the wall behind him, where petrol had pooled thickest, and fired. What happened next occurred too fast for human perception to track individual events, but slowly enough that everyone watching understood they were seeing something unprecedented. The flare struck the petrol-soaked wall and ignited the vapors that had been building for 40 minutes. The initial flame was almost gentle, a blue shimmer that raced along the wall surface at speeds approaching sound. Then the vapor concentration in the lane itself reached ignition threshold. Crawford had been correct about the thermal dynamics, but had underestimated one variable: the degree to which 15 running tank engines would create a convection current in the confined space. The Tiger tanks were not simply moving through petrol vapor. Their massive engines were actively drawing that vapor toward their air intakes at combined rates exceeding 10,000 liters per minute. When ignition occurred, every tank in the column was simultaneously pulling burning vapor directly into its engine compartment. The phenomenon that Allied investigators would later describe as cascade thermal saturation began with the centermost tanks in the column. Their engines, starved of oxygen and flooded with burning vapor, ceased functioning within seconds. The automatic fire suppression systems inside each tank activated, but these were designed to handle electrical fires or small fuel leaks, not the wholesale introduction of external combustion into the engine bay. one by one. Starting with the fifth tank and spreading both forward and backward through the column, the engines ceased operation. What Crawford's plan had exploited was not simply mechanical failure but psychological paralysis. The German tank commanders, trapped in a narrow lane with burning walls on both sides and engines failing throughout the formation, faced a decision matrix with no good options. Abandon the tanks and retreat on foot through hostile territory, or remain inside and attempt to restart engines in an environment of unknown danger. The commander of the lead Tiger, Hauptmann Klaus Werner, chose to advance his tank out of the affected zone, but his engine lost power before clearing the vapor concentration, leaving him blocking the forward exit. Werner would survive to provide detailed accounts during post-action interviews, and his testimony revealed the psychological dimension of Crawford's tactic. Werner described the sensation of watching his instruments fail while breathing air that tasted of petrol fumes, of hearing 14 other tank engines cough and stall in near-simultaneous sequence, of understanding that his invulnerable fortress had been defeated by something as primitive as burning liquid and vapor physics. The shame, Werner said later, was almost worse than the tactical defeat. Crawford did not witness the immediate aftermath. His plan had always depended on immediate withdrawal, and he led his men through the drainage ditch at a pace just short of panic. They covered 400 meters in under 3 minutes, expecting at any moment to hear the sound of machine gun fire as German infantry reacted. That fire never came. The German tank crews, focused on their disabled vehicles and the mysterious vapor attack, did not pursue or even spot the retreating British soldiers. The section reached Allied lines shortly after 8 in the morning, exhausted and disoriented but intact. Crawford's first action was to report the position of 15 disabled German tanks to the nearest artillery officer. His second action was to sit down heavily against a tree and shake for approximately 10 minutes, while his body processed what his mind had refused to acknowledge during execution. He had just bet 8 lives, including his own, on a theory about vapor combustion ratios. The artillery officer, Captain Thomas Reed, initially doubted Crawford's report. 15 Tigers disabled without firing a shot seemed implausible, bordering on fantastic. Reed dispatched a reconnaissance patrol, which returned 90 minutes later with confirmation and photographs. The Tiger tanks remained where they had stalled, with German crews attempting engine restarts while others provided security. Reed immediately called for fire missions, and by noon, artillery had rendered the disabled tanks permanently non-operational without the Germans ever bringing their formidable guns into action. The tactical impact of Crawford's action rippled through the Normandy campaign in ways that became clear only with historical distance. 15 Tiger tanks represented approximately 5% of all operational Tigers in Normandy at that moment. Their sudden loss disrupted planned German counterattacks and forced redeployments that weakened other sectors. More significantly, the method itself became the subject of intense Allied study. Technical analysts from the Royal Armoured Corps arrived at Crawford's position within 3 days to document the physical evidence and interview participants. They found petrol residue extending 72 meters along the lane, vapor burn patterns on the stone walls reaching heights of nearly 2 meters, and tank engine components showing characteristic damage consistent with thermal vapor ingestion. Their final report, classified until 1967, concluded that Crawford had inadvertently weaponized a phenomenon that mechanics had been trying to prevent in engines for decades. The psychological dimension proved equally significant. German tank crews throughout Normandy began exhibiting heightened caution when moving through confined spaces, particularly in early morning when vapor concentration would be highest. Allied intelligence noted decreased movement speeds and increased use of reconnaissance before committing armor to narrow lanes. The German armed forces of the time never fully adapted their tactical doctrine to account for this vulnerability, primarily because command structure did not facilitate rapid information sharing about such unconventional threats. Crawford received the Distinguished Conduct Medal in a quiet ceremony 4 weeks later, but the citation was deliberately vague about the specific action. The official record mentioned exemplary initiative and tactical acumen in the face of superior forces, avoiding details that might compromise the method for future use. Mitchell, Hughes, and the other 6 men received commendations for actions during the same period, similarly vague in specifics. What military records could not capture was the personal transformation Crawford experienced. Hughes noticed it first during the weeks following the action. Crawford became quieter, more internal, spending long periods writing letters to his daughter, but rarely sending them. When Hughes eventually asked what troubled him, Crawford's answer revealed the moral complexity of warfare that official reports never acknowledge. Crawford explained that he had spent his entire military career repairing machines, restoring disabled tanks to operation, keeping the tools of conflict functional. In one morning, he had inverted that entire identity, using his mechanical knowledge not to preserve but to disable. The 15 tank crews had been someone's sons, someone's fathers, someone's brothers. That they survived the encounter due to their quick reactions was due to chance rather than Crawford's design. He had been willing to accept their deaths as the cost of his section's survival, and that willingness had changed something fundamental in his understanding of himself. Hughes later wrote in his memoir that Crawford's moral struggle represented something larger than one man's conscience. The mechanization of conflict had created a distance between action and consequence that previous generations of soldiers never experienced. Crawford had disabled 15 tanks without ever seeing the enemy's faces, without the intimate confrontation that had characterized warfare for centuries. This distance was supposed to make violence easier, more abstract. Instead, Crawford suggested, it made the moral weight heavier because it removed the possibility of mutual humanity in the moment of action. The technical innovation Crawford had stumbled upon saw limited but documented use in the remaining months of the Normandy campaign. At least 3 other instances of vapor-based tank disabling were recorded by Allied forces, though none achieved the scale or completeness of Crawford's action. The Germans adapted eventually, modifying tank air intake systems and adjusting movement protocols in confined terrain. Like most tactical innovations in conflict, the window of effectiveness closed within weeks. Crawford survived the conflict and returned to Britain in December of 1945. He resumed raising his daughter Emma, who was then 11 years old and barely remembered the father who had left 4 years earlier. Crawford never spoke to Emma about what he had done in France, never mentioned the medals stored in a drawer he rarely opened. When Emma asked years later why he seemed so different from other veterans who shared their experiences, Crawford told her that some experiences were not stories to be shared, but weights to be carried privately. He worked for 3 decades as a civilian mechanical engineer, specializing in industrial safety systems for factories and manufacturing plants. Colleagues who learned about his military service found this career choice puzzling, given his evident expertise with military equipment. Crawford explained when pressed that he had spent enough of his life thinking about how things could be broken. He preferred to spend the remainder understanding how they could be made safer. The historical evaluation of Crawford's action evolved over subsequent decades as military analysts gained distance from the immediate tactical context. Early assessments focused purely on the technical innovation and tactical impact. Later analyses, particularly those written after 1970 when the full reports became declassified, began examining the psychological and ethical dimensions more deeply. Professor Andrew Morrison, writing in 1989 for the Journal of Military History, argued that Crawford's action represented a case study in asymmetric tactical thinking. Morrison noted that conventional doctrine would have dictated withdrawal or defensive positioning for a unit as outnumbered as Crawford's section. Instead, Crawford had identified a vulnerability that existed only at the intersection of terrain, technology, and timing. His willingness to exploit that vulnerability, Morrison argued, demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that often determined outcomes in mechanized conflict. But Morrison also noted the darker implications. The vulnerability Crawford exploited was not a design flaw in the Tiger tank, but rather an inherent characteristic of any combustion engine operating in confined spaces. This meant the tactic was not specifically anti-German, but universally applicable. Allied tanks were potentially just as vulnerable, as were civilian vehicles, industrial equipment, or any machinery that combined engines with poor ventilation. Crawford had opened a door in tactical thinking that revealed uncomfortable truths about technological vulnerability. Mitchell visited Crawford exactly once after the conflict ended, in 1953. They spent an afternoon walking through the English countryside near Crawford's home, discussing everything except the morning in Normandy until finally addressing it directly. Mitchell asked the question that had haunted him for 9 years, whether Crawford truly believed they would survive the withdrawal, or whether he had accepted death as the probable outcome when he formulated the plan. Crawford's answer was characteristically precise. He had assessed survival probability at approximately 40% when the plan was executed. The remaining 60% represented acceptance that 8 men would likely end their lives in a French drainage ditch if the tactic failed, or if German reaction was faster than anticipated. He had made that calculation not as a tactical abstraction, but as a father who had written a final letter to his daughter before beginning the operation. The letter remained in his possession, never sent because never needed, a tangible reminder that courage and recklessness existed on a spectrum rather than as distinct categories. This revelation troubled Mitchell deeply because it suggested Crawford had been willing not only to risk his own life, but to gamble with 7 others who had not been fully informed of the probability assessment. Crawford acknowledged this moral complexity without attempting to justify or excuse it. Command, he suggested, often required accepting responsibility for others' lives based on incomplete information and imperfect probabilities. The alternative was paralysis, which in combat circumstances typically guaranteed the very outcomes one hoped to avoid. The German perspective on the incident emerged slowly through post-conflict interviews and historical research. Werner, the Tiger commander who had led the column, provided the most detailed account during a 1972 interview for a British documentary. Werner described the mechanical failures as initially incomprehensible because they occurred simultaneously across multiple tanks with no apparent external cause. His first assumption had been sabotage, possibly contaminated fuel, until the pattern of vapor ignition became clear. What haunted Werner most, he said, was not the tactical defeat, but the realization that 15 of Germany's most powerful tanks had been rendered useless by a tactic that relied on nothing more sophisticated than liquid fuel and basic physics. The Tiger tank had been designed to be nearly invulnerable to conventional anti-tank weapons, protected by armor up to 100 millimeters thick in critical areas. Yet it had proven completely vulnerable to an attack that never touched its armor at all. Werner noted that German tactical doctrine emphasized armor protection, firepower, and mechanical reliability. The vulnerability Crawford exploited existed in a conceptual blind spot where mechanics intersected with tactics. German engineers had focused on preventing vapor ignition inside the tank through fire suppression systems, but had never considered the possibility of external vapor being deliberately introduced into engine air intakes. It was, Werner suggested, the kind of innovation that only emerged from genuine desperation, combined with specialized technical knowledge. The lasting impact of Crawford's action extended beyond immediate tactical consequences. The incident became a teaching case at military academies, examining unconventional tactics and adaptive problem-solving under extreme pressure. The specific method was less important than the principle it illustrated, that technological superiority could create its own vulnerabilities, and that those vulnerabilities often existed at the intersection of design assumptions and battlefield realities. Crawford died in 1994 at the age of 88, having lived to see the Cold War end and the military technologies he had worked with become museum pieces. His daughter Emma, by then a retired teacher, found among his papers the unsent letter he had written before the action in Normandy. The letter was brief, direct, and heartbreaking in its attempt to explain to a 7-year-old child why her father had chosen to risk his life despite his obligation to return home to her. In the letter, Crawford had written that he hoped Emma would understand when she was older that some decisions could not be avoided, simply because they were difficult or dangerous. He wrote that he had learned from raising her alone that responsibility often meant accepting outcomes beyond one's control, while still doing everything possible to influence those outcomes positively. He wrote that if she was reading this letter, he had failed in his first responsibility to survive and return, but that he hoped she would remember him as someone who had tried to protect others when he possessed the ability to do so. Emma donated her father's papers and medals to the Imperial War Museum in 1996, including the unsent letter and the photograph he had carried throughout the conflict. The photograph showed Emma at 6 years old, laughing in a garden somewhere in London, captured in a moment of childhood joy that had somehow survived the surrounding darkness of conflict. Museum curators placed it alongside the citation for Crawford's medal, creating a small exhibit about the human dimension of tactical innovation. The exhibit text, written by historians with access to declassified documents, attempted to contextualize Crawford's action within broader themes of the Normandy campaign. They noted the desperate circumstances faced by Allied forces in the weeks after the invasion, the technological challenges posed by German armor, and the importance of individual initiative in overcoming systemic disadvantages. But the exhibit concluded with Emma's observation that history often remembered the innovation while forgetting the cost, not just the physical danger, but the moral weight of decisions made in moments when conventional options had ceased to exist. Modern military analysis of Crawford's tactic focuses primarily on its lessons for contemporary asymmetric conflict. Defense analysts note that the principle of exploiting technical vulnerabilities through unconventional means has become increasingly relevant in an era of complex military systems. What Crawford demonstrated was that sophisticated technology often created dependencies that could be targeted by actors with specialized knowledge and willingness to accept high risk. But the analysts also note the limitation of Crawford's approach. It succeeded because of unique combinations of terrain, technology, timing, and technical knowledge that could not be easily replicated. The 15 Tigers were disabled, not because Crawford's method was generally applicable, but because multiple specific conditions aligned at one moment in one location. Attempts to systematize the tactic for broader use failed because the required conditions occurred rarely enough to make dedicated training impractical. This points to a larger truth about tactical innovation in conflict. The most dramatic successes often emerge from circumstances too specific to reproduce, created by individuals responding to immediate pressures rather than following established doctrine. Crawford had not consulted manuals or requested authorization. He had assessed his resources, identified a vulnerability, and acted within a window of opportunity that existed for perhaps 60 minutes on one morning in 1944. The courage required was not primarily physical, but intellectual and moral. The courage to trust his own analysis, despite its deviation from every conventional approach. The 8 men of Crawford's section all survived the conflict and returned to Britain. They maintained contact for decades, gathering occasionally to share meals and memories. Hughes, the youngest, lived until 2015 and was the last survivor. In his final interview before his death, Hughes reflected on what the morning in Normandy had taught him about capability under pressure. Hughes said that before that morning, he had believed courage meant absence of fear, or some kind of internal strength that special people possessed. Watching Crawford formulate and execute his plan had revealed a different understanding. Crawford had been terrified, his hands shaking as he distributed the petrol, his voice tight with tension when explaining timing requirements. But Crawford had possessed something more important than fearlessness, the ability to continue functioning, despite fear, to make calculations while acknowledging their mortal implications, to lead others into danger he had chosen on their behalf. This observation points toward perhaps the most important dimension of Crawford's story. It was not about superhuman capability or exceptional heroism, but about ordinary competence, elevated by extraordinary circumstances. Crawford had been a mechanic who understood engines, a sergeant who took his responsibility seriously, and a father who carried his daughter's photograph as a reminder of what he hoped to return to. None of these characteristics were unique. What was unique was their combination at one moment, when the right technical knowledge intersected with tactical necessity and personal courage. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.